Good Lord, get ready, you got to move.
George and I have been working on this together, and George has been a collector of art for a long time and has known all of these people and was instrumental in a lot of what Norman and I were able to discover about Finster around the United States. So together, George and I are actually just going to have a conversation with our panelists about how they came to know Howard Finster, what it was about him that really was fascinating to them. And it's going to be kind of a free-flowing conversation. And I hope that you find this as interesting as we did as we put this panel together. George is going to start with the introductions at that end, and then I'll finish them, and then we'll get into the conversation.
Introducing the moderator.
Oh.
We need it.
Okay, this is a great opportunity to put a human face onto Howard, to find out some of these stories. This is going to be an awful lot of fun. I'd like to start out by introducing Phyllis Kine. Phyllis Kine is the most respected and renowned dealer in self-taught art. She started her first gallery in 1967 in Chicago. It wasn't really started with self-taught art. The Harry Who was involved in art at that time, and she started to learn about people that were doing things that were different, that really weren't totally from an art school. And Phyllis just has a great feeling about honesty in art, and she deals in really all kinds of art. In 1975, she came into New York with her gallery, and self-taught art wasn't something that was mainstream at that time, and Phyllis certainly isn't mainstream, so you'll learn about her in her talk today. To my right is Rick Berman. Rick Berman is a ceramicist. He has an MFA in ceramics, and he taught for many years at Senewald Community Arts Center in Atlanta. He was a dealer in self-taught art for 17 years in Atlanta, and he does make ceramics today, and he's teaching at the Pace School, Pace Academy in Atlanta. He's done research and writes on rural art of Indian potters, and he'll have a book coming out sometime in that, and that'll be of a lot of interest. So that's my introduction. You want this?
Sitting next to Phyllis is Lynn Spriggs. Lynn joins us today from Great Falls, Montana. She began her career in art with an undergraduate degree in studio arts, painting and printmaking, and came to New York in the mid-'80s and began working with Randall Morris, and that's when her interest in non-conventional art and culture began. In 1988, she began graduate study at Columbia, and in 1992 got her PhD in American Indian art history. She went to teach the first course in American Indian art at Harvard's art department, Harvard's art department, and in 1996 became the curator of folk art at the High Museum. In 2003, she left the High to become the executive director of Paris Gibson Square Museum of Art in Great Falls, Montana. And sitting next to Lynn is Thomas Scanlon. Thomas came to know Howard as he went along with a friend in the early 80s, I believe, to meet Howard, and seemed to have a special connection with Howard from the beginning. Thomas has been one of the main ways for me to really get to know Howard Finster, in spending being very generous with his time and his collection, both Norman and I, so that I really came to see Howard a lot through the things that Thomas and Tommy had collected. Thomas also has a jewelry store in Dahlonega, and which is about 2 hours north of Atlanta. So I thank all of the panelists for being here and start our conversation.
Diane? I'd like to open this with a remark about, number one, I think collectors, because Colin pointed out that the role of the collector as an indicator was so important, and the way that I heard about Howard was through Herbert Hemphill, who actually took me by the hand and gave me every piece of information that he knew on a silver platter. In the very early 70s, we went to Tennessee and we went to the North Carolina. I can't go into how many places, but one of the things that he had discovered through Jeff Camp was Howard. And the other thing besides collectors I want to mention to you guys is artists, which is my other way of hearing about the work of self-taught artists, because my artists all went shopping in junk stores and thrift shops, and one of the artists called the work trash treasures that they would find, and they would, you know, you'd be walking with somebody and all of a sudden he'd start moving a little quickly and all the other artists would go to that one place to see what it was he was looking at. And so the artists themselves were collecting material like this. And of course you probably know that Jim Nutt discovered Ramirez when he went out to Sacramento in 1972 and shared it with me. So anyway, thanks to Herbert Hemphill, I heard about Howard. Then I went through Jeff Camp, and then Howard learned from an artist that I still show. In fact, it's my next show, Victor Ficcinto, who's down at Wake Forest, and who's a close, close friend of Howard's, and by the way, has wonderful footage of the garden, and painted, gave him a Cadillac to paint, a white Cadillac, Victor. And Victor kept sending me his work from Wake Forest, and I was going, well, isn't that the Phyllis Kine Gallery in New York? And Victor said, yeah, I just said, well, you mean I don't have to send them to Jeff Camp first? And so that's the way it all started, and now you all can take over. But do remember that it's the collectors, Tom. I'm so glad to see that that realm of people is represented, both in the audience and up here.
Thanks. I actually came to first find out about Howard's work in a similar way also through Bert. I moved to New York a few years later. I moved to New York in '86, and 2 weeks later found myself working on a film called Swim in Cambodia. Jonathan Demme was directing it. So I was meeting Jonathan, I was working with Jonathan, meeting people like David Byrne and others who were also involved as friends. And a lot of them were collecting. Jonathan, of course, was collecting Haitian work, and David was collecting all sorts of great outsider stuff. And Lewis Allen, who was the executive producer, also had a great collection. And so all of them, from time to time, kept saying, go see Phyllis, go see Kevin Morris. And I found my way to Kevin Morris Gallery. And it was through them that I met Bert Hemphill, who I worked for on weekends as I was going through graduate school. And again, incredibly generous spirit, and just unerring eye and vision. And I learned so much from him by just hanging out with him and talking with him about artists, including Howard. I had a second learning curve with concerning Howard's work about 10 years later, in '96, '97, when I moved to Atlanta to become the curator of folk art there. 1 year earlier, there had been a gigantic birthday party for Howard, and a few years earlier in '94, the High Museum had, through an incredible undertaking, come to bring several of the most important pieces, if there was such a thing, several of the large-scale sculptural pieces from Paradise Garden into their permanent collection. which of course introduces all sorts of interesting ethical issues, and we can talk about that later if we get to that. I became intrigued with Howard at that point through Bert Honeykeep, another collector, an incredible collector. Anyone who wants to know about Howard Finster, go see Bert. He came at it, as I did, from an ethnographic perspective. He had known Howard for many years, had been integral in bringing pieces from Paradise Garden into the museum. And he started teaching me a lot about the history of Howard, about the Tryon days, and about what an incredible self-entrepreneur he was and self-marketer he was. In the very, very early days in the 40s, how he realized there was one highway running from the north to the south, and he was on it, and he was going to make full advantage of that, take full advantage of that, see Rock City sort of approach. So it was during that time that I actually went up to the garden. And of course, seeing the garden changed my life. So.
Well, seeing the garden changed my life as well, much to my surprise. A friend, I'd heard of Howard Finster from my high school art teacher in the late 1970s. And so a friend said, I'm going over to see this guy. Would you like to ride along with me? And I said, sure, I'd like to meet Howard. So I went over to see him, and we talked for a little while, and he had other people there at the garden. But he asked me as I was leaving, he said, when are you coming back? And I thought that was kind of interesting. And I said, well, by and by. You know, I'll stop back another time. But a few weeks later, I got to thinking, well, maybe I should go back and just see him again and see if he was the genuine oracle as it looked to me on first blush. And so I did go back, and we struck up a friendship. Now, I'd like to know how many people in the audience, by show of hands, had met Howard. How many people have met Howard? And how many people, keep your hands up, how many people consider Howard a friend? He made friends very easily. I mean, everybody was Howard's friend. You couldn't know him 5 minutes without being his friend. But we did strike up a friendship, and I felt like Howard gave, or I won't say burden, but he charged me with the responsibility of having some pieces when he knew, or he felt like the end of his days were here. When he knew that he would not be able to maintain the garden much longer, he allowed me to acquire pieces that I think are significant. And I think he allowed me to acquire that because he knew that I would try to make sure they got back into public hands at some point in the future. But he was a wonderful person. If you never had a chance to meet him, I'm hoping that the exhibit will show you something of Howard.
Hey, everybody. I'd just like to say that if Howard were in a situation like this with all his friends and people from all over the country, he would call this watermelon time, which I always thought was such a nice expression. I met Howard I went first saw his work at the Botanical Garden Show in Athens. I think it was in '81, if I'm not mistaken, and was just completely wiped out by the work, and then went to see him and spent 6 hours with him like everybody in this room probably did. I always tell people I had to kick him off my car to leave Somerville because he was so enthusiastic about everything. And then bought a few pieces of work, and then I'd come back in a couple of weeks and I'd buy a few more pieces of work. And then of course the work started selling. And from time to time when I went back I'd usually go on a Monday because our shop was closed on Monday. And he would say he would save me some things, and he would go in and there'd be a few things here and a few things there, and he'd say, okay, these are for you. And I'd say, well, what about that big pile over there? He said, oh, that's Phyllis Kyne's pile. So I said, well, Howard, can I buy a few of those? He said, oh yeah, go ahead and take them. He said, I'll remake it.
My biggest news, I was going to tell you, Norman, was this business about, at this particular time he stopped making important things. If he knew I was doing a show, he would take the time to work and concentrate on things and make me great, except for the ones he took right away out of his hands.
And he remade them for you, Phyllis.
Yes! I want it back.
Phyllis, I heard that same story from John Denton last night. I don't know what you ended up with.
anyway, a little bit about self-promotion, which is always an interesting part of Howard's life to me. In the early days when he lived in Alabama, he was preaching. You know, he was like a, what do you call it, a street preacher. And he would give away tracts, you know, like little pieces of paper with evangelical things about the world's coming to an end and all that. And basically his work are tracts. You know, that if you had to describe what they are, that's what they are. Has everybody heard that word or not? Is that something southern? I don't know. But anyway, so when he would go to one of these small towns, he would pull his car up, and it had this pictures and books. You know, it had something like Howard Finster, or Preacher, or something like that on the side. And he had a loudspeaker, you know, like a microphone and one of these kind of speakers that has batteries in it. And so he would start preaching into the loudspeaker. And after a while, you know, people would start gathering around, and then before you know it, the police would come, and they'd say, well, you know, it's against the law to use a speaker on the street. He said, okay, I'll put it away. I didn't know that. Meanwhile, all the people had come. So he knew that was the case, you know. So that's Howard's cleverness. And so many things stand out. I mean, again, nothing new to anybody here, but Howard thought of his dealers and the press and Johnny Carson and Talking Heads and REM and blah, 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 you know, all the different things he was on and in, and the front of the Wall Street Journal and all that. Those things were his missionaries. Howard always thought of those as his missionaries, and he was totally and completely honest and convinced and authentic about it. So, you know, Phyllis was one of his missionaries in New York. So, I mean, Howard is so real and so authentic and so kind and so thoughtful. I mean, all of you people here that have spent time with him know that. There's just really never been anybody like him, and I don't see how there can ever be anybody else like him, or even a generation of these kind of people again. You know, civilizations rise and fall, and there's always another civilization coming. We don't know exactly what it is, but I just want to give my heartfelt, you know, just the feelings of how wonderful Howard really was. Every time he saw my baby, you know, 15 years ago when we came to New York, Howard's show at the, what building? I forgot the name of it.
Oh yeah, it was the Time Life
I don't remember
show.
what it was called. It was a big deal. It was a big retrospective. It was John Turner's book. And so my child at that time was just born. And so Howard, every time he would see him, he'd come to our gallery or we'd go to his house or whatever, every time he would see him, he would give him a $100 bill. And he still has that money. My son is 15 years old now. And that was his bank account, and he still has that money. But that's the kind of things Howard did for probably thousands of people. He just had that kind of spirit about him. And it was totally and completely for real. Wasn't he?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely. Can I ask you a question, Norman? Those slides, a lot of the slides that you showed us at the end, which, I don't know, seem to have some very mysterious Gregorian chant. Maybe that was just in my mind. I don't know. I kept hearing music when I was looking at it. But did you?
What would Howard have done with Gregorian chant?
Howard would have heard different music, I think.
That's some good down old Southern music.
How many people here think that they, or each of you, could do a whole masterpiece show just from that show that we saw later? Oh, I'm the only one? Well, I could do another masterpiece show tomorrow.
Oh, yeah, sure, of course.
Oh, yeah.
And I'd also like to say that Howard, to wit, to woo, knew what a masterpiece was too. And he could have told you from now until doomsday that quantity was the only thing that mattered.
Of course.
But when he did a show for me, those things were for Phyllis Kahn, and he wasn't doing that quantitatively. He had his own view
Of course.
of quality, that's all. Anybody else?
I was wondering, in talking to a lot of you throughout the past 2 years, which is how long we've been working to put this all together, how important do you think it was knowing Howard to collecting his work? Was that necessary to collecting the work, or did you know him first? Did you collect the work first? How did that work?
Well, I've wondered that myself on several occasions, but I can't say because I didn't collect the work until I knew Howard, so I can't really say whether it would. I think I would have enjoyed Howard's work, but he was such a strong force that I can't separate the two. It would be ridiculous for me to think that I could. But it would be interesting to find out how people are affected by the work without having. Howard obviously was a very charismatic individual, there's no question about it. But I think the work obviously stands on its own. But for me, it's inseparable because a lot of times I hear Howard's voice when I'm thinking about a piece. And I like the last photograph that you showed with Howard pointing to Jesus, because I could just, you know, did you see this?
Yeah.
Did you miss that? You know, and I could see him doing that same thing on the works that I've acquired.
I think that's a great point about the inseparable nature of the man and the works. And I think it brings us around to that whole issue of authenticity. One of the things that I've always admired and that has inspired me most about all of this work, and in particular Howard's work, is that quality of inseparability. It's this absolutely direct relationship between the person, the creator, and the creation itself. One of the things that I found fascinating when I went to the garden was the fact that he was a collector, he was a preacher, he was an artist, but he was also interested in museum work. And he had created his own museum. I didn't realize that before I went to the garden. You know, all of these great, collection of museum to the inventions of mankind. He was extraordinary in everything that he did and poured himself into everything that he did. In fact, at his funeral, I was actually surprised that he hadn't created his own eulogy after something that would be said that he had. I mean, I thought he would have. But as Reverend Billy quoted at his funeral, we've lost a prince and a great leader. And he really was. I didn't know Howard before I knew his works of art, but he came across so brilliantly in those works that when I met him, it was just sort of another layer. And the garden was another big layer as well.
Well, I'm just passing this to Rick, but I have to remind my friend here about what piece she thinks was the most important at the High Museum.
Oh, I see
And
one of the
how
things-
well did you know Margaret Morgan?
That's right, that's right.
She's a professional. I mean, if you only know the art, then you only know the art.
This is kind of a neat thing. I don't know.
And you are too.
Not very. I am.
A professional.
Okay. Not very many people know about this piece because, as far as I know, it's never been published. But it's my all-time favorite piece, and it has a great story. It's a life-size piece, which I guess was cut out of a 4x8 sheet of plywood, so it's about 7.5 feet tall. And it's Howard, believe it or not, in a dress. Howard in drag. And the message on the thing is that the reason is he's wearing a dress. It's because in the old days, when he was a farmer, it would get so hot in the summer that all the farmers would wear dresses. It's like I've never heard anything like that in my entire life, and I've never talked to anybody else that ever heard.
But I don't
anything
believe it, do you?
I swear to God, it's amazing. Another kind of funny thing about Howard, when we went to New York, whatever year that was, I had never seen Howard drink. Like, it never occurred to me, because he was a fundamentalist Christian, that he was real strict about his, all that kind of stuff. Although he would eat like 5 or 6 tablespoons full of coffee and then drink some hot water. So he definitely he liked to speed, let's just put it like that. And one time Howard said he didn't take his shoes off for about 10 days or something like that.
What?
He didn't sleep for 10 days.
He showers once a month.
At any rate, so this is John Turner and Howard and Mr. The director of the Folk Art Museum, and I can't remember his name, Bob? Bishop. And so we went out to this restaurant, and so Howard ordered a shooter of scotch, and he just, he slammed it. And I said, good Lord, when we got home that night, we were talking, I said, Howard, I never did you drink. And he said, oh yeah, sometimes I'll have a drink in the morning, and it makes me feel good all day. And also, this is kind of funny, it may be offensive, but I asked Howard once about sex, and he said that he hadn't had to bother with that for a long time.
Bother. Where were we?
Was it a collection?
Yes, it's very important. Oh, no.
Collecting is
You just said something and I thought, Oh, drinking. You know the Devil's Vice? He did that several times.
Yeah.
If you read all the words on the Devil's Vice, he says you can't know how bad things are unless you try. And he talks specifically about cocaine and how God put cocaine on this earth to tempt us with. And now you better be careful if you do it. You better be careful because it really is nice, but. And then he goes on and on. And he talks about liquor too. You know those paintings? So he wasn't an addict though.
Coffee.
Well, speaking of Howard in a dress, there's another unsung hero in this that I think is not thought of much, and that is Pauline. And I think Pauline really, if any of you know Pauline, she is fantastic, and she really kept home and hearth together so that Howard could be Howard, and just Howard. I mean, being Howard was a 48-hour-a-day job, there's no question about it. But she really, I think, supported him. You know, they say behind every good man is a good woman, and I believe that's very much the case in a lot of ways. My own wife supported myself, but I think that Pauline definitely sacrificed a great deal so that Howard could do his work that he felt he was charged to do on this earth.
Tom, when Victor told me that the first time that Howard ever stayed at his house overnight, he painted the entire hallway. Because, you know, he didn't sleep at night. He would sleep, you know, maybe he'd sleep for 15 minutes after he worked for a couple hours. So then when Howard had a show at the New Museum of Contemporary Art in New York City, I think it was at 82, and he wanted to stay at my house, and I, at that time, I was on the 3rd floor on Spring Street, and I had this big windowsill. It was about this big. And I don't know if any of you remember, but we did have something called Twin Towers on the south tip of Manhattan, and Howard sitting on the windowsill and saying, "My father made that. My father made that tower." And I thought, oh no, don't fly out my window. And I said, "Victor, you're not going to let him sleep here unless you stay." And Victor was up all night. I mean, that's Pauline's job too. I mean, she must have been watching him around the clock.
Around the clock.
Well, I do have a fun story to tell you. You know, Howard called me Sister Phyllis. And he once told me a story about this Jewish lady who came to see him. And she brought me, he said, she brought me some chicken. And Sister Phyllis, that was good chicken. That really was good chicken. Someday you and I, we just gotta go into business together and make ourselves a chain called Infidel Chicken.
Howard said he loved everybody. He even had Buddhist friends.
But I don't think he knew I was Jewish. I don't think so.
I don't think he knew I was Jewish either. One thing I think we should say, while we're here, why not, is Howard had his own language. John Denton knows more of these than anybody here, but for instance, when Howard would go somewhere to do a workshop, when he called it Virginia Techs in Blacksburg, Virginia, he would call it a workout. Somehow he heard workshop, he turned it into a workout. When he met, what's the guy that owned the pop shop? I just grew up on
Herring.
Yeah. So when he met Keith Haring, he called him Chief Harry. We had our gallery was on a street called Euclid Avenue, like Euclid geometry, Euclidean geometry. Anyway, he called it Eclude. And then, of course, Elvis he called Alvis. John, you got one?
Yeah. Oh, well, photographers, we're photographers.
Photographer. Pat.
When I first met him, he said, there was a fellow who came down from New York, and he said, I remind him of that famous artist that just died, Andy Warhol.
I mean, it goes on. It could literally be
But
a
if
whole
you read
dictionary.
him, you'll see the same mistakes
Right.
that he writes out too. Yeah.
And this was Robert Lee High School when he came here.
Robert Lee.
Robert E. Lee High School.
Lehigh.
Yeah,
Oh, this was? Probably.
No, he was.
Lee.
That was generally high school, yeah.
My last name is Scanlon, but he would get wound up and sometimes call me Stanley for some reason. Pauline would say, "It's Thomas, Howard, it's Thomas," and he'd say, "Well, Stanley, it's and he knew a Stanley that he was. He told me he was fond of him, thank goodness. But Stanley, wherever that came from.
I think all of that also reveals Howard's ability to promote his own freedom of speech in a real way. His interpretations of the Bible were not your typical interpretations of the Bible, but in everything that he did, there was a great freedom to speak his mind, to speak his heart, to speak his beliefs, and he didn't hold back. And that's one of the things that I value most about him. He just went for it over and over and over again. And somebody mentioned repetition, and I think that's really important in his work. That power, I mean, his message was really the same all the time. Whatever it is, whatever your gift is, get out there and put it to use every day and make the world a little bit better while there's still time. Because otherwise bad things are going to happen. But he said it 1,000,000 times, over and over.
Anybody here ever walked down a New York street with him? He stopped everybody on the street. Now, do you know the good Lord is coming tomorrow? Are you prepared? I mean, it was so embarrassing. He would not hesitate to speak to any stranger and engage them in conversation. I hope you're a true Christian. Are you a true Christian? And do you go to church? And do you pay attention to your wife and take care of your kids? And I mean, oh my Lord. Just walked around that way all the time. Anybody else?
One of the things I think some of Howard's most important work was his influence on other people to create their own artwork. When we would go down to Folk Fest, it was hard to get him out of that building. I would drive him down and then driving him back. He would always try, he was diabetic. He would always try to talk me into stopping and getting chocolate milk and pork rinds, pork skins for you. He loved that combination. And we'd strike a deal that he could only drink half the chocolate milk, and he would stick to it. He was pretty good about that. But he loved Folk Fest because he met people, and he loved to meet the general public. But trying to get him out of that building, because the artists would say, "Howard, you changed my life. I'm an artist now because of you. I was afraid to paint. I was afraid I'd be ridiculed because I wasn't good enough." But there are any number of people I know that paint now and create their own artwork and even do their own, make their own living because of Howard's influence. And I think that's one of his most significant contributions.
I don't know if I'm going to hurt anybody's feelings here, but he had no taste. And he would trade paintings with any artist that came by to see him. So if you went up that tower, you'd walk up and you'd see, oh my word, you'd see all kinds of icky-wick things, so nice. And then it would turn out that he had given somebody one of his in exchange.
But that's not a matter of taste. That's a matter of social
generosity
integration.
and spirit.
It is generosity of spirit, but I think he thought they were kind of nice.
He saw good in most people and most art.
Yeah, he thought everything was pretty nice.
Obviously, Howard has made a great impression on many, many people. You were saying it didn't make it have a eulogy. Perhaps this is the beginning of his eulogy. Does anyone have any thoughts about the lasting impression of Howard, or is he going to have anything to say to us in the future? Does he have a message that's going to carry forward from here? Seems like this show upstairs is so powerful, so palpable that maybe there's something for future generations that Howard has to say.
Well, I think that's what art's about. I think that we're still looking at Chimabue, and I think that the things that Howard had to say and the vocabulary that he invented, see, if I made up my list of what art is, I would have to say it was something in which one person had invented a vocabulary form that was totally his or her own and that was recognizable no matter where you saw it anywhere, and that it had range, and that was a body of work. And everything about it was so amazing that your feet would shake, you know. And Howard did that, although he worked so much and so hard that it wasn't consistent. Although someone like Wolfley was. But that doesn't matter. I found that out over the years, that some people are really consistent and some people aren't. But when they have that genius in them, it's going to come out, and if it hits you and you know it's there, you just keep looking for it. And I saw a lot of it in those slides, Norman, that you show that just happened not to be the ones you've chosen. So I know that those things that I have in my little gallery right now, I have a bunch of animals cutouts, you know, but he did a lot of them. He did the goose a lot of times and the tiger a lot of times, and I can't sell them. I mean, how much can I ask for those things? And they're so great, and someday they're going to be worth a lot of money.
You were 35 bucks back then.
Yeah.
35 bucks.
I wouldn't sell one for less than a couple of hundred, but even that is stupid. It's stupid, because the least becomes the best after a while. Just keep that in mind.
And the idea, when I was in Howard's bedroom a few hours after he died, and I was standing there thinking about this body of work this person had created, and I saw the numbering book that he was working on lying there on the bed, and I went over and picked it up, and I looked down and I thought, wow, it was 46,991 works of art. And that's something else. And if it's not all masterpieces, so be it. But he did some good work. And the thing I like to collect in Howard's work is the intimate pieces. People approach me about pieces constantly, and they say, and they're surprised that I look at a 4x4 and pass by it with hardly a glance. Because the things that I like to collect are the things that cause me to breathe in when I see it, just taking this small breath, like, you know, it doesn't have to be big, it doesn't have to be splashy. One of my all-time favorite pieces is a little piece that's up here. Probably my very favorite of those pieces is Brian Scott, and I heard you say that was a beautiful piece. I'd love to hear that.
Yeah.
Because, and it doesn't show this horror vacui that he's so known for. It shows a very simple, very graceful figure, almost with a Mondigliani tilt to the face. And it was just an amazing piece to me because it was so straightforward. It was Howard showing the love of this child that was a relative of his. And I thought, that's intimate.
And it's there.
It's intimate. And what I like the best on those works is when you really get something of Howard from the piece itself. Now, his job was to put as many Bible verses out in front of the general public, and he did that admirably. But his work also was occasionally charged with very poignant, intimate, even from so much as a line or two in the written word of it. And that's part of Howard that I think is very special and always has been to me.
You're right, Howard touched people's souls and he never gave up. 40,000+ works later, he never gave up. His whole life, he kept at it. And he was always about one thing, the will to transform. That will to overcome whatever it was and to be better. And I don't think we can ever have too many of those folks around, but he did it so brilliantly. He was an absolute genius.
I think it's important to point out that, I don't think there is such a thing as an outsider aesthetic, but I think it's important to point out that most of the outsiders, or all of them, have an ulterior motive. In Howard's case, it was preaching. That's all he wanted to do was proselytize. And because he was doing it for that reason, he wasn't self-conscious about it. He didn't think of it in terms of some article he read. See, what happens with an artist in the art world is he or she reads something about him and they go, and the next thing you know, they believe it, and they believe the myth about themselves, and they're finished, they're over, they're done for. He can't, because he's doing it for Christ. And if you think about it, Wolfley had a whole other narrative going on in his mind. He had a real reason for doing it. I don't know what Ramirez's reason was, but I sure know that he knew. And it's awesome for an artist that's gone to school and has to forget everything, has to figure out which things he or she learned in order to forget them, then wait for the muse to come in the window. It's like the pitcher that spits on a ball or something. It's like, and sometimes it works. I don't tell you that it doesn't happen with an artist that's gone to school. Despite the fact that that artist went to school, that artist can be a genius. And that's why we can recognize a Van Gogh or a Cezanne, because it starts to be called style. And that's why you can recognize Howard. Anywhere you can recognize Howard. And you can recognize a Wolfley or a Ramirez. And just keep that in mind. And a Carlo, no matter where you see it. And that's what the genius is. And if you see a work of genius, your knees start to shake. That's how you know. Just like you said, it's a catch in the breath.
I'm going to give this to Rick, but one of the things I have is a letter that Howard wrote to Phyllis. As a matter of fact, when he just finished his 5,000th piece, he was charged by God to create 5,000 pieces. After he did the 5,000 pieces, you know, the letter is really sad to read because he's saying, I'm putting it on the bus to you today. So apparently he shipped some of the work by bus.
All of it. Greyhound bus.
Greyhound bus. But it's a sad letter because he says, people won't let me let the paint dry. You know, talk about not creating masterpieces. They wanted the work and they were clamoring for it, and they wouldn't let him get the things finished before they had to come off the easel. So I'm putting my 5,000th work to you on the bus today. Ultimately, I don't think he did that, but
it's my letter.
Well, it was back in Howard's hands. But anyway, the thing is, I have a work that was executed about 2 weeks later. And I asked Howard about that. I said, now, what's this? I have this letter here that says you're through with it. You can't do any more. You've done what you said you would. That's it. And he said, well, you know, I just took a little break. He said, I had a little time off, like it was a vacation. And I was sitting around, and after about 2 weeks, I thought, well, what am I going to do with myself now that I've created these 5,000 pieces? And he said, you know, I kind of enjoyed working on the work more after that because I'd done my job. I had fulfilled my obligation to God, and from this point on, I can do any work that I want to. And so from that point on, he worked again after a 2-week break.
Do you have any more of my mail?
I got her work and he got everything. Just a couple of things about how different people respond to different things for different reasons. When I hear Tommy talking about it, he responds to the personal kind of work. Mine is always visceral, all right? What I call, like if I jury a show, I give good marks to things that I want to steal, basically, is how it works out. So, yeah, I know. It's like an intoxication. You feel an intoxication. It's just like with music. Music's a higher art form, which I feel pretty sure about that. So you never quite feel the emotion with looking at a visual as you do when you listen to music. But when you do stand in front of a piece of art and it I don't know of another word, it intoxicates me, and I want to steal it, then that to me is a good thing. It has nothing to do with the theme or the context or the writing on it or the color. I can't really explain what it is. It's just something goes off, and it's almost like your eyes cross, and you go into some kind of rapid eye movement or something. I can't really explain it. That's the things that I respond to. And it's just like with music, I respond to the music and not the lyrics. So it's just some connection there, and I don't know what it is. At any rate,
it's a symptom of being a collector.
Yeah. And one thing I was going to say about collectors a while ago is the collector, the true connoisseur of anything, is the same of visual art is the same exact thing as somebody who is a connoisseur of music, because there has to be an audience for dance and music, and there has to be an audience for makers. And it's exactly the same energy. And always the people that are buying the work are visionaries, just like the people making the work. Like the first people that saw Cezanne, for instance, they were Cezanne, in my opinion. And they don't have that kind of skill, but they have that kind of eye and that kind of
The
sensitivity.
receivers.
Yeah, the receiver.
When I used to take my kids to the museum, not all of them, I have 4, reacted the way, but 2 of them did. I would say, tell me which one you want me to buy you. And they would always, well, my daughter Rachel would always choose the one thing I loved the best. Damn, she didn't know exactly what it was. Of course, that means that she had excellent taste.
No doubt.
I play a game with people that I go through museums with, and I say pick your 3 favorites and you can't resell it. So you have to have it the rest of your life, but pick your 3 favorites and tell me why. And what happens once we've left a museum or a collection, several hours later, or even an hour later, and you're talking about this, they've had time to digest it, and I find out what stuck with them as well as what stuck with me. And it's amazing, especially when I go through with my wife, how many times we agree on the same, your first favorite, you know, and then there's always the argument, I picked it first, so you can't pick it.
Just in terms of the technique that Howard used, as Norman talked about how Howard liked to hit the work with a hammer and to show how difficult it was. In terms of the work that you collected or the work that you curated or you've seen, what do you think about the preservation of Howard's work, and what have you done about some of these materials that may not be quite as durable as tractor iron?
Some of the pieces, you better enjoy them today, obviously, because they're not exactly archival material. He didn't really care that much about it, obviously. But I've worked with Howard trying to clean up the large bottle. I have a good formula for removing pigeon droppings if anybody wants it, because they bruise me over the bottle. But I felt like I have some sense of responsibility to Howard to try to stabilize some of the work if we can, and let what can survive, and at least the images will survive even if the work doesn't. You know, the color changes probably. Of course, everybody knows the marker material has a short life. If you put it in the sun, it has practically no life at all. But while you have it, you can enjoy it. And I've tried to, as I said, stabilize some of the pieces that I have so that they'll survive longer term. What about the museum?
Well, the High Museum is in a very unique position in that it's the largest collection, public collection of Howard Finster's work that there is. And I always enjoyed working with conservators within the museum as a curator of folk art, because it pushed all their buttons. You know, they wanted to wear those white gloves, and they didn't know what in the heck to do with the bird droppings, or anything else for that matter, whether we should change the frame or leave it the way it was, even though it looked horrible. So a lot of issues came up in that regard. The material, the collection of about 150 pieces came to the High Museum in '94, which was 3 years before I arrived. There was then a very large-scale restoration project, conservation project, to go through piece by piece and really make sure that it was stable before many of the largest works were put out on exhibition. When I first got to the Hive, one of my first questions was, well, how did Howard feel about this stuff being literally yanked out? I mean, these cement pieces were way, way down into the ground. This was a major undertaking, getting these things out in one piece and into the museum. And I found correspondence, as well as talking with Howard himself, that made me feel better about that. He was happy. He was really happy that they were going to the museum. And in fact, I've told this story before. Bert Honeyke told me that at one point when they were pulling one of the large pieces, it's a child in the cicatrice den, in the den of snakes, out of the ground. And they'd been pulling and pulling, and finally, in a moment, it was pulled out. And it was there by itself, separated from the garden. And Howard gasped when it was pulled out. He couldn't believe how beautiful it was. Just that one work. Classic Howard, right?
Yeah.
But he himself was really happy that there were some pieces that were not going to go through that whole organic process that is happening now. What did it take, 7 years? I was talking to someone, 7 years to fill that swamp that he lived on, on which he created Paradise Garden. And now it's slowly going back into that swampland again, the full circle, that organic quality that characterizes so much self-taught art. And I think it's part of what I love about the work, that organic quality, that ephemeral nature of it. And at the same time, I think it's terrific that we can all go to a place like the High Museum and see those gorgeous sidewalks and see those magnificent sculptures that he created. Kids especially just go crazy for them. But it really is, I think, it's an interesting experiment and an interesting example of what one can do as the Kohler is doing with other art environments. And I think it's really important for us to continue to think about how we take care of those places and those works of art as a body of work.
One of the things when Howard started offering me significant pieces out of the garden, I didn't buy any of the cement pieces because I felt like they should stay in place, although I felt the signage and the large pieces probably were deteriorating very quickly and should be kept in a better environment. And I would talk to Howard about this. I said, how do you feel about the garden being dismantled? He said, it's a very natural thing. He said, I fought the weeds back, and he said they'll overtake it. And he said it won't really matter in the long run anyway because all this art's going to burn up. You know, he said it was just not a big deal that the garden would go back, and it didn't make him sad at all. He thought it had served its purpose, and that he got a great deal out of it, and he thought it was a fine thing for the pieces to be removed from it. One of the things I think is interesting, a lot of people don't realize too, though, is those pieces that we're talking about, it was pretty ingenious how he did the mountains, and these things were quite often done on washer machines and dryers that were stacked up, or refrigerators that he would then throw a little bit of wire over and put the cement on top of that. So if you go into Paradise Garden and you cut some of those mountains in two, you would see a washer machine or an old refrigerator that made the body of the mountain, and the rest of it is a cement shell over it.
Tom, you just reminded me of something that Bert Hemphill told me early on when I started spending time with him. I'd look at all of his works that he had, and there were a lot. There was barely room to walk through his home, as we know. But what he said was, I don't own any of these. And collectors here, we know that. He just explained himself as the steward for a time. And when Bert died, and more of his works went to the Smithsonian, and I saw others of them in sales, I had to remember that's just the nature of life. Things do pass on, and we're just the keepers of them for a while. Certainly the case with Finster as well.
I just think, first of all, thank God for enamel.
Painting again and again.
And there was a good deal of that.
He conserved a lot himself.
He did.
Over the years.
But there are other artists who didn't. And there are places, there are sites like Noah Purifoy and Joshua Tree, for example, is one. And Grandma Brisby was never saved. It was just horrible. There are these absolutely amazing things, and they were just falling apart. Kohler couldn't do it because they have to buy something and then gift it to somebody in order to do it. So I think it's important for all of us to keep these things in mind and try whenever possible to help. In fact, I have Noah Purifoy with me. Big book of them, I want to show you. Anybody else?
I just remembered another word that Howard used. Somebody bagged me out of it instead of begged me out of it. Right, John? Anybody else? Another question?
Here.
Howard always said to me, well, I'd like for you to end up with the contents of the studio intact when I go. And I said, I don't have the storage space, Howard. He said, well, you'll end up with the studio. He said, you should buy the studio when I die. Well, Pauline said, Howard always wanted you to have the studio contents. So one of the things that I thought today to be in a way of Howard reaching out even now to you is that I brought a grouping of the black and whites that he called his bread and butter pieces. These things that I think you're going to pick up one at the end of today's discussion, and it will be divine intervention which one you end up with. They're just all mixed up, so maybe there's a message there for you to hear. But these pieces were in Howard's studio when he passed away, and so I think today you'll have a little memento of the show and the talk, and something from Howard, although he's not here in body to hand it to you. I think through me it's been sent up for you to have a souvenir, as he would call it.
I just wanted to see if there are a couple, we have time for a couple of questions from the audience. Does anybody have a question for Ken?
I would love to just get some feedback. Something's been running through my mind since Colin Rhodes talked about the outsider discourse, the train of thought from Morgenthaler to Dubofay to Cardinal. And Norman Gerardo also referred to that discourse in defining masterwork criteria. I'm wondering, does anyone have a problem in grounding the valuing of masterworks of Howard Finster in a discourse that's grounded in writing about art from the asylum?
I don't. You know what that reminds me of, Jen, is a conference I went to a few weeks ago called Disability Art. And the first thing I said when I got up there was, there is no such thing as disability art. I mean, if somebody is disabled and makes art, that's amazing and wonderful. And I think if somebody is a schizophrenic, I think we've been told that as a percentage of genius amongst schizophrenics is approximately equal to the percentage of genius in the world at large. And I don't see why it should make any difference at all.
I suppose what I'm asking is, does this connote a pathological nature to the masterworks of Howard Finster?
Why should it?
I see it as just good art. There's good art and bad art in different areas, sculpture, painting, crafts, whatever. By the way, that's the worst thing I ever said in my life. I'm on a mission to try to annihilate the myth of painting and sculpture being, when somebody says I'm an artist, what they really mean is they're a painter or a sculptor. And through the history of art, the history of the world, all the way back to cavemen, great art has been made out of every material. It could be jewelry, it could be ceramics, it could be painting, it could be drawing, it could be whatever. So I take that back. But yeah, I mean, it comes down, there are different genres. There's, abstract expressionism. And in that area, there's some really great, unbelievable things that are just some of the best things ever made in the history of the world. And there's a lot of it that's really bad. So it's not, to say, because somebody's an outsider, or disabled, or in a mental institution, they're making good art, is just absurd. That's all.
Yeah, Pat.
Well, I guess these are not so much.
Even the question. Let me interrupt you just a second. Even the question of mental stability comes into call. We quite a few of us, me included, live in a very glass house to be throwing those stones. When I talk about the obsessive artist, I'm pretty obsessive myself in that sense. So to say that one's mental stability has to be called into question when discussing the work, I think it's just really not a, where do you start and where do you stop, I guess is what I'm getting at. Sorry.
And I would just add that insanity versus sanity, I don't know, people come up to me that aren't comfortable with this work for one reason or another, and they think that it's about insanity. And I just say, a lot of these artists that I've met are some of the sanest people I've ever met. So.
Well, I don't really have so many questions, although there are so many, but I'd just like to comment on some of the things that were brought up. First of all, Howard personally to me dispelled my fear of spelling. That troubled me for many, many years. And when George was saying about what will carry on from Howard, things like that, and so many of the panelists were all touching on him, his preaching. But I could never imagine Howard, from the first moment I met him, to be at a Southern Baptist convention, and first of all, being asked to speak, and second of all, when they're all getting together, the Baptist preachers from different churches, for them to even want to associate him, because he was so much beyond anything that they were in their congregations, I think. And the book, The 2,000 Light Years Away, in the Vision Craft with his Pauline and his neighbor JR and his wife, I mean, I sort of think that's where he is. And the first time I met him, he actually had, and I've never seen this before, and it goes along the way you were saying that he picked people to fill us yourself. And I don't know, all I know is that it said on the back of it, put my messages on scarves, neckties, sweet shirts, and, you know, for sweatshirts, for t-shirts, and help me save the sinking world. And so I did go on to do certain things with Howard, and he really did change my life. But the other day, like a month ago, Bill Clinton was in Pittsburgh, and he'd signed 1,000 books, and I just had a feeling that he would come out before he got in the SUV and took off. So I rounded up my kids, and I went home real quick. And for some reason, I had 2 copies of Stranger from Another World, and I picked the one that Howard did not sign, and I just took it, and I had a Roy Finster bust that Clinton signed for me. I said, and this book is for you. And like last week, I get this letter, a thank you note, a personal one, and thank you for the Strange from Another World, and how great, those kinds of things that Clinton did. But I'm thinking, boy, that's really nice. He takes the time, and you know, I knew he would read it because he sucks up everything, and he's Southern, Howard's Southern, and how could you resist the cover anyhow? But I'm thinking, what's going on? He's like, did that book get in Clinton's hand because of Howard's with the famous, and how's that spread the word? And just like, that's what the wildness of it is. So who knows, but I think he's out there, and he's with us so much today. And I'm very grateful to be here.
And speaking of him being with us, I'm sure that Howard's watching us right now and probably amused at all this discussion. I asked him one time if he felt like he'd been successful. And he said, no, he really didn't feel like he'd been successful. And I said, well, how would you have been successful? And he said, well, if I'd been like Billy Graham, if I'd had radio messages and gotten more people and all that. But I'd like to say, Howard, I think you're pretty successful.
I think just one last sentence from each one of the panel members, and then there'll be the trolley ride that will take to the other galleries, and then tonight the opening will be in the gallery at 6 o'clock. But one last word from each member of the panel about Howard.
Well, I'd like to say again that I appreciate the efforts of the 3 curators for this show. I appreciate everybody coming and taking an interest in Howard, because that's how his work, again, like Pat says, goes on beyond just this space. And I hope that we can remember Howard and think of him as somebody who never met anybody he didn't love, and I think that really was the case. He was a good man, and he had a good influence on me.
And I think what would make Howard the happiest is for all of us to pass it on. Whatever we got from him, to pass it on. Keep it alive.
I'd like to think that Howard proselytized for what we're calling outsider art. And somehow he himself, without realizing it, wormed his way into a lot of hearts that otherwise might not have looked at work like this.
And I would just say that, again, thanks to Ricardo and Armando and Diane. And be sure, you know, and when you see the show, and I guess there are other shows in different venues and stuff, drink deep, you know, because there won't be that many times that this much work comes back together. I mean, it's a very labor-intensive thing. You worked on it for 2 years or something. So, yeah, just take your time and look at things. And it sparkles, you know. Howard sparkles. I enjoyed being here, by the way.
We all did.
Well, we want to thank everyone. I was looking at the audience, and everyone was just spellbound. I knew we'd enjoy this, just hearing this firsthand. And we thank you very much. And just one thing I was thinking of, if someone was walking down the street and they saw Howard Finster and Phyllis Kine and had to introduce them, they would say, "This is the Reverend Finster, and this is the Reverend Phyllis Kine."
That's a jump from sister, isn't it?
I just want to say one thing. Someone asked about the film this evening, because some of the posters say 8 o'clock. It's really at 7 o'clock this evening. It will be down here. Also keep in mind that the special reception for all of you starts at 6 here in the gallery. We're going to have Jimothy the Fool playing Finsterian banjo and Justin Solenka playing Finster-style piano and other things. So please come for that. Thank you all.
You got to move, you got to move, you got to move, you got to move. And the good Lord